You are the warrior, the mythical dragon slayer, the hero who must prove your worth through courageous acts. We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Unless we make things within the unconscious known to us, they will govern our lives, and we shall call it fate. Those were some quotes from Carl Jung. The point of this video is to summarize the book titled The Interpretation of Fairy Tales by Marie-Louise von Franz. I want to reduce the key points into comprehensible and usable tools to better become affected by and appreciative of the wonderful stories surrounding us in our everyday life. Alright, so an archetype is a recurrent symbol. It is a primitive mental image inherited from the earliest human ancestors, and it is supposed to be present in the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a part of the mind which is latent and tied to ancestral memory and experience. It is present in all humans. The unconscious in general is the part of the mind which is inaccessible to the regular, everyday conscious mind. Unconsciousness, however, does manage to affect behavior and emotions. Fairy tales are the purest and simplest expression of the collective unconscious. Fairy tales represent archetypes in their simplest, barest, and most concise form. In this pure form, fairy tale archetypes give us the best clues to understanding what is going on in the collective psyche. In myths or legends, we get an overlay of cultural material, but in fairy tales, we get something much less specific. This makes fairy tales better able to mirror the basic patterns of the psyche more clearly. A famous psychologist by the name of Carl Jung came up with the concept of the archetype, which I reiterate is a recurrent symbol. It is a primitive mental image inherited from the earliest human ancestors, and it is supposed to be present in the collective unconscious. An archetype is something you can't witness directly. It is something very ethereal, and there is very little you can do to translate it into intellectual terms. But there is something you can do to seize and capture these archetypes. Alright? We have to cast a wide net of associations. We have to weave together a joint effort of curio, of intriguing objects to hopefully entangle the ethereal archetype within. Fairy tales are wholesale. They are relatively closed systems. The specific things within them compound one essential idea. So this essential psychic artifact, you can say, is hidden in and expressed all throughout the story's meaningful images and events. All fairy tales endeavor to describe one and the same psychic fact, but a fact so complex and so far-reaching and so difficult for us to realize in all of its different aspects, that many repetitions are needed until this unknown fact is delivered into consciousness. This unknown fact is what Carl Jung calls the self. Alright, so you can think of the archetypal self as something that is never really observed alone. Think of it like the wind, right? In a way, the wind is like an activity which acts on complementary playthings. The wind is ethereal, and unless it plays with the fallen leaves on the floor or acts upon something, you wouldn't perceive it. Also, if the wind stood still, then there would be no way you would pay it any mind. An archetypal image is not to be thought of as merely a static image, for it is always at the same time a complete typical process, including images in specific ways. An archetype in a story is latent, like the air, and just like a gas, it spreads out evenly and exerts equal pressure against the container that it is in. We have to recognize the indefinable vagueness of an archetypal image. Still though, we should try to get as close as possible. We should try to become as specific and determinate as possible, instead of saying it is hopelessly subjective, because it is not. God is in the details, as the saying goes. Next, the book talks about the historical schools of thought regarding fairy tales. So, until the 17th and 18th century, fairy tales were told to adults as well as children, and they were treated as an essential spiritual occupation. After that, scientific interest in them began to grow. The attitude towards fairy tales evolved when people around this time felt that Christian lore had something very emotionally lacking in it. People began to emotionally crave something more vital, earthy, and things involving instinctual wisdom. One hurdle, though, before the attitude towards fairy tales properly matured, was that people believed the conscious, everyday, ordinary life was exclusively the source of all inner life. They took for granted and overlooked everything else. They had inclinations to believe in things within themselves which were active outside conscious life, but when confronted with emotions that resonated with dreams and fairy tales, both of which are very related to the unconscious, They just relished in those sensations, but they did not explore what those sensations were pointing at, right? So, the unconscious uses emotion as a tool for communication. And when you come across as a manner of speaking, when you come across a entangled archetype, entangled in art, entangled in stories, emotionally, there is something resonating with that archetype, right? And until a certain point, people just relished in those sensations, but they did not explore what those sensations were pointing at. When the Brothers Grimm published their book on fairy tales, it became a success and it became widely circulated. It was then that people realized there was a hidden emotional interest that resonated with the fairy tales. In every country, people began to make basic collections of their fairy tales. At once, everyone was struck by the enormous number of recurrent themes. The same theme in thousands of variations came up again and again in French, Russian, Finnish, and Italian collections.